It may not surprise you to know that I'm not normally one who likes to sit down and read poetry. But I was reading a magazine just this week. It wasn't the Women's Weekly or Match of the Day. It was another illustrious magazine called Journal for Preachers. I know. Anyone else a subscriber? The opening sentence of the first article declared that preachers should read more poems and fewer commentaries. A great poem can jolt your faith. So given that I hadn't honestly a clue what I was going to preach on today, because there are only so many different angles you can take on Palm Sunday, I thought I'd take a punt and do a cheeky Google search and lean on the Spirit. And the poem that came up for me was by a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, Mary Oliver, and it's entitled "The Poet Thinks About the Donkey." Can you read it from the...
On the outskirts of Jerusalem, the donkey waited. Not especially brave or filled with understanding, he stood and waited. How horses, turned out into the meadow, leap with delight. How doves, released from their cages, clatter away, splashed in sunlight. But the donkey, tied to a tree as usual, waited. Then he let himself be led away. Then he let the stranger mount. Never had he seen such crowds, and I wonder if he at all imagined what was about to happen. Still, he was what he had always been, small, dark, obedient. I hope, finally, he felt brave. I hope, finally, he loved the man who rode so lightly upon him as he lifted one dusty hoof and stepped, as he had to, forward.
Thanks, Edie. Fear not, do not be dismayed. I'm not going to be digging into the anthropomorphism of the donkey this morning. But the last 6 words of that poem just shone off my computer screen like a beacon to me. Stepped as he had to, forward. While the crowds were spreading their cloaks and palm branches and they were singing Hosanna and celebrating the coming kingdom of their father David, it's all too easy to get swept away with the celebration and the hope of the moment and forget that Jesus, even as he was being surrounded by accolades and riding into Jerusalem, he knew what was coming for him. He tried to tell his disciples 3 times already, but they just didn't get it. But Jesus, like the donkey in Mary Oliver's poem, stepped as he had to, forward. In our Lent studies this past week, we've been looking at John 16, and in particular, we've been digging into the paradox of what it is to experience grief and joy at the same time. And the study focused us particularly on verses 21 and 22, where Jesus compares his death and resurrection to a woman giving birth. In John 16, we read, "When a woman gives birth, she has distress because her time has come. But when her child is born, she no longer remembers the suffering because of her joy that a human being has been born into the world." The video that partnered with our studies this week was from Emily Spence, who's a friend of ours, who's one of the co-priests out in All Saints Hataitai. And in it, she talks about how people don't really think or talk about labour until they discover that you are pregnant. And then suddenly all these stories of other mothers' labours come out, and you're left with the knowledge that you have to go through this. You have to give birth somehow. But then you have the beautiful joy that comes after it. Despite the pain and anxiety of the moment, a woman too steps as she has to, forward. It was so good to have Bishop Justin with us here last week. It was his second visit with us. The first time he came, he preached about Jesus' death, and last week he preached about the power of the resurrection. He unpacked how, thanks to the power of the resurrection, there is always another, more glorious way forward. Even if what we are facing feels insurmountable, there is always another way. thanks to the resurrection, we know that even death is not the end of the story. But the thing that stood out to me most was Justin's passing comment that the disciples were not exactly brave people. But thanks to the power of the resurrection, they went on to share the good news, to heal and resurrect people. And most of them even went on to endure their own torturous deaths. They stepped, as they had to, forward. But this is where, for me, there is a deep irony. Because those of us who know and love Jesus and believe in the power of the resurrection, we often find ourselves reluctant to share that good news that we ourselves have received. When it comes to those nudges to share the good news of God, so often we are so frightened and we feel it's such a perilous thing to do, to share our faith, that instead we just shut our mouths and hope that the way we live our lives will somehow reflect our love for Jesus and the hope and the coming of his kingdom. But the truth is, each one of us is called to share the good news of Jesus. We are called to make disciples of all nations. And even if we're like the donkey in that poem, and we're not especially brave or filled with understanding, we are called to step forward as well, to share the good news. Now, one of the most painfully inspiring things that I have experienced is talking with Jesus followers who know that they are facing death. I had the privilege of doing this with Ray just a few days before he died. But the first time I had this kind of conversation was about a decade ago, and it was with my good friend Lizette Wesling. Lizette was a remarkable woman who died aged just 44 of a rare and aggressive cancer. She was one of the most gifted sopranos I've ever had the privilege of working with, and was blind from infancy. But a few months before she died, I had this conversation which has stuck with me. And she just started talking about how being blind for her actually wasn't really an issue. The thing that brought her the most anxiety and worry was her stutter. It stopped her being able to communicate. But then all of a sudden she just blurted out, "Richard, you know what? I'm not afraid of dying. I know and love Jesus. I know he's with me, and I know death is not the end." Even facing the inevitable uncertainty of her death, she stepped, as she had to, forward. And that's the power of the resurrection. Even death is not the end. And just as all the scripture, right from the beginning of the Old Testament, points towards Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection, it also points towards that glorious day when Jesus will return. And when the world is restored to the way it was in the beginning, when the new Jerusalem descends, possessing the glory of God, and where there will be no more death, or mourning, or sickness, or crying, or pain, because these things will cease to exist. When we are facing what seems to be insurmountable, whether it's childbirth, illness, death, grief about what's happening around the world, or even the anxiety about sharing our own faith, cling on to these promises. We have so many things that hang like a millstone around our neck. Cling on to these promises of Jesus, that death is not the end, that there is always another way. Cast off that millstone and wear the yoke of Jesus. Because Jesus' yoke is light. His burden is light. His yoke is easy. And remember that we too have access to the resurrection power of Jesus. And that our eternally faithful God, creator, redeemer, and giver of life, promises that he will restore the world as he first intended it. Cling to these promises and step, as you have to, forward.